Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Bedy Yang, Managing Director at 500 Startups. Bedy, could you take a few minutes to share your story and how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. As you mentioned, I joined a long time ago. I did join about 9 years ago, 500 Startups. We started in 2010. And a lot of my journey was to figure out what to do at international level. So when we started investing, and in venture, normally it's a very local business, or it used to be. Like a lot of the investors would invest, especially in early stage, where you can drive to or cycle to. It was almost unheard of investors going and flying across the world to try to find early stage talent with that. With 500, I found a really good fit. I am Brazilian, and I think that background, being Chinese Brazilian, living in the US, I have spent extensive time also in Europe, that allowed me to have this global vision to say, let's try to take the capital to different parts of the world. That's my super strength. A lot of the time we talk about what's your superpower, whether it's your investment thesis or whether it's you as an investor. For me, it's building communities. The past 5 years, I've been really focusing on how to build a 500 platform. Now we have 2,500 investment. And then we also work very closely with investor networks so that we can build out and do a lot of knowledge sharing.
Thank you, Bedy, for this introduction. That was really cool. And I can say firsthand that you are really good at sharing insights and best practices, making sure the bar is raised. So, Bedy, you've been 9 years in 500 startups. How has your investment thesis changed over time, and what does it look like today?
Yeah. That's a great question, because when we started, I think a lot of people were very skeptical to have a large portfolio. I think what we've seen, and luckily our first fund, it's doing quite well, is that the model, which is a little bit of the science component, works. So what is the model? The model is that we will invest in a large quantity, because most of the funds invest in 20 companies. So we're looking at a large portfolio size, and very often we double down when things are working. So I think that core part of the investment thesis is the same. What changes is how we structure the funds. So I think historically, when I just joined, the main fund would invest everything at a global level. And then in the second generation, we started looking at having even more like regional funds. I think the third generation, we think the hyper specialization also has its benefit. If we're interested in certain industry, if we're interested in certain technology, that narrowing and focus, it's ever more important. So the way that we're structuring it is to have even more specialized funds. So whether we're thinking about industry or a country, and then the plan is to build out that entire platform that we have.
Very nice. And that will lead to my next question. If you could go back 7 years ago, so you were 2 years in 500 startups, what one advice you would give Bedy 7 years ago?
When you know a lot about a market, that's when there's a little bit of risk associated with it, because you're so convinced that something won't happen. And that's the beauty of innovation. You don't know. You are creating that space for it. And I think that is a very fine balance to run. If your system is correct in that early stage, you have to allow yourself to push for the limit. And the more you know about the market, you run the risk to not be able to see the next transformational opportunity.
But here there is a conflict. You say you need to have conviction, which you had, and at the same time you would go back 7 years ago and tell Bedy, actually some of your conviction, be soft about it or be flexible or assume you could be wrong about them.
I think the conviction I need to have is around the team. A lot about the art of the early stage raising and investing, it's building trust. Mm-hmm. So you don't know anything about the founder. You don't know anything, but can they build the trust? So the conviction I need to have, it's really into the founding team. And the founding team pivots.
Actually, I remember an interview you gave a while back about failure, and we should look at it as a budget. Do you mind telling? Because I thought that was a really good insight.
Yeah, I think it's similar when we think about portfolio, right? You have to think on the entire budget, not, oh, I lost like 100,000, I have 1 million. You have to look at like spending now, because when you look at the return, it's in that entire component that needs to come in. The focus is not there. And that's when you would lose, because it's not on the single deal, it's in that budgeting, is in that focus, is in that portfolio.
Very nice. So I want to spend maybe 5 minutes on the incubator side of 500 startups. And this is even more meaningful because the very early stage, this is where we can become more inclusive, improve diversity, especially for entrepreneurs who don't normally have the family and friends checks. Yeah. So how could you explain how the incubator setup you have is helping that?
Yeah, so I think the most important component on the intersection between the acceleration program and you be able to be more inclusive, there are three components in investing. First is your deal flow. Where does it come from? The second component is your investment decision. The third is helping companies grow. So those are the three phases. So the acceleration incubation program allows you potentially to influence the three of them. So first thing we do to think about that is, what are the pockets of networks we want to recruit, right? If I'm Chinese Brazilian, I very easily have my network into those markets. So it comes from the network that we're building, and can we proactively change that? So that's the first component. The second component that is very important is the investment team. So part of that investment team that we often try to do is, do we have different position to decide whether the deal makes sense, the deal doesn't make sense for it, right? So I think that's another component for that. And then the third one is the helping companies grow.
Very nice. And you mentioned about methods, but we talked about it before. It's also about having patience, being able to take time to be able to create these opportunities.
Yeah. Sometimes with corporate venturing, we're thinking budget cycle year by year. So when we think about innovation, when we think about investing, and I think that's one of the biggest sort of lessons from early stage investing, is that it takes 10 years for us to see companies become wildly successful. That's our first fund. It took Twilio, Talkdesk, at least 7 years to build the business where they are in. And if you're looking at 1 year, it's okay, but then you should go to late stage. So don't go into that crisis mode where I definitely want to do early stage, but I want to see result in like 2 years. I think that's where you are not setting yourself for success, for expectation and the metrics that you're looking at.
So my comment earlier was more about improving diversity, inclusion, there are methods, but if I look at what you did for VC, for example, you took longer to make sure that it had diversity versus starting quickly. That's where I was coming from.
Yeah. So a little context, the VC Unlock is the investor training program we have been running at 500. The reason I got that program started is because when we were investing alone in emerging markets or outside of Silicon Valley, we were almost like the only investor. And I would see really dirty cap tables of like people owning 50% in early stage where they were adding like no value. And we need to clean cap tables. I was like, what if we standardize our documents? What if we like share what has been working and it works coming early stage, be a small investor, add value to it. So we start opening our learning the playbook, investing to the world.
I can only comment for VC Unlock 2019. I can tell you it was a beautiful, diverse picture of the class. No doubt. It was great. I seriously think it achieves the objectives, which is to raise the bar across the world. And I think that ultimately helps the entrepreneurs. How do you see CVC, direct investments into startups, versus CVC becoming limited partners into institutional VCs, including 500?
I think one of the most important thing on the corporate venturing is, can you find the best deal flow? So regardless of what you're working, that's a question I would take back home and ask yourself, how can I find the best deal flow? When you invest in other funds, that will allow you to create a baseline, right? You're just starting in this business. So when you are setting that up, is to really ask how financially are you driven, and then how strategically are you driven? If it's strategic, then is investing directly in the startup the best way to get that strategic outcome you have? And then if it's financial, are you there to win with this very competitive venture market? So very often investing in funds allow you to learn a lot faster from who has been doing that year over year.
Very good. And so clearly that's one reason to be a limited partner into funds. Do you see other good rationales to do that?
Yeah, I think there are two components that I mentioned. One is the deal flow, another is the insights that you get from it. And if you are building your own practice later, you can also learn depending on how each fund operates on sharing those information.
Okay, thank you. Another question about corporate venturing, which is really wide open. What would be the best practices, maybe 2 or 3 that you would give someone that is starting a corporate VC?
I think getting started on the CVC side, there are several paths to it. You can write from your balance sheet. You can set up a separate entity that your corporate deploys, or you can build out a fund where your corporate entity is a main LP and then you raise outside money. I think the fastest way, of course, is if you don't have to set any structure and you do on your balance sheet to test it out. The only recommendation I have for you, if you decide to do so, you should regardless do your homework of what is the investment thesis, what is the objective on running this. And then the structure itself is a byproduct of it. But I recommend you go through how you're going to think about selecting those companies and building the flow for it.
Very nice. So something I want to ask about is decision-making for investment in the team. But before that, I have a really good building up question. What is the most valuable background for an individual to have on a CVC team?
So you mentioned team, right? I think it's being able to find a good composition between someone who understands really well the corporate needs and can navigate, especially if you have a strategic component to help navigate that. And I also recommend having someone who understands the venture itself. It's not a difficult business, but it requires practice. So in a team, maybe find that great combination between someone really experienced in the venture who has done like a general partners and funds.
No, this makes a lot of sense. And I agree when you look at a CVC team about, are you looking at people who have done operations before, people who have done VC all the time?
Yeah, the corporate VC, you want to ensure like there's that composition. A general partner in a fund, normally there are 2 types of profile. One type of profile is an operator profile. So I'm an entrepreneur, I had an exit, I know exactly the pain points that entrepreneur is going to go through. We don't take a board seat, but if I'm taking a board seat, I would know the struggle, I would know the fundraising, I would know all the way to the exit on whatever it's needed. It could be also an operator in a large sort of platform companies. Very often it's in the growth of that platform that it's very important. Maybe it's not in my board component, but if you ever need a connection to a co-investor, I know majority of the investor were building this network of investors. So you needed a co-investor in Cambodia. I can find you a co-investor in Cambodia, in Kenya, in like different parts of the world. You need to hire someone that can help you on building that network. Into that, you need to have an advisor and know so many people who can help you with that. So people who are really good connectors also have an edge to it because they can find proprietary deal flow.
Very, very nice. So if you think about early investment, like you said, it's extremely risky. Early stage investment is even more risky. And some corporates think they are prepared to do that, and then maybe they don't realize how risky it is. Do you have any advice about corporate VCs that are just starting and they feel like they should invest very early stage? And I'm talking seed and not Series A is not early stage. I'm looking really earlier than that.
I heard one term, I thought it was really interesting when you are in late stage or right after COVID. One of the corporate venturing person mentioned like a concept. I thought it's like really interesting. You don't want to be catching a falling knife. And that's part of the reason they thought, oh, like when something is really late stage, I'm uncomfortable with. What if they're only syndicating a deal because they can't find anywhere else? So we want to come into earlier stages. I think understanding your motivation in early stage, if it's for true innovation, you can build a portfolio, you can build a team, be my guest to join that.
Yes, I remember an advice I received 2 years ago, which is there are only two types of startups: the one that need your money and the one that don't need your money. And you want to invest in the one that don't need your money. So if they need your money, there's sometimes a signal here.
They've gone through everyone, right? What are the chances they're going to you if they have come through first 500 or YC before, right? So they're doing early stage. Are you catching what other people don't want? If you feel you can still win, that's fine. But I think if you're participating in this for financial reason, it needs to go in to win. If you have other reasons, we think we need to do this for whatever strategic, then just define whatever the strategy is.
Yeah, very true. In a way, I look at 500 startups and the way you've described it is you're building a mesh networks that keeps getting stronger and stronger. And I think the 2000 startups in Mexico is a beautiful example of that. This is really impressive. Were you surprised?
Yeah, we were. I think we knew the numbers were going to increase. And then that's the beauty. You can build that anywhere. Because we always have to think there's a Silicon Valley, but it's the consistency of work, the continuation of work. One thing we really, really recommend people do when you are starting your CVC or your venture, or whichever it is, it's build a brand for yourself, but because it's a very crowded space. So how do you either build a brand or be close to people with the branding so that you see similar things and then you start building your own voice added to it?
Very good. So we talked about the CVC report, but we haven't actually talked about what's inside the CVC report. Do you have 1 or 2 minutes explanation about what it is and why people should actually read it?
Yeah. So the CVC reports have a few components. So we have done the survey with over 100 corporates. We wanted to map out some of the lessons learned. So the way that we designed it, there's a lot of like tricks between, for instance, I talk about like the CEOs. Another very, very important trick that it's into the survey is don't try to be in the middle between financial and strategic. Pick one side. It doesn't matter which side. If you pick the middle, you are set for failure. And that's not what we're saying. We heard from the hundreds of people that joined that. So there's a lot of tips and methods that we add into the CVC report. But the part that we really like, and it's super fun.
Very nice. So I want to give a chance for you to give maybe a inspiring tip or advice for someone who is starting in corporate venturing. What would you tell that person to think about to be able to be successful in the space? Not just getting started, but the right advice to be successful.
I think the number one thing is don't be afraid to ask and be in the network. You're building something no one else built before. We are maybe second or third generation of corporate venturing, right? Like early days, there was one that it wasn't that successful, but it's a whole new generation. So you are at the forefront on what the right corporate venture looks like. So be close to where the network, be close to where the VC world is, because we're really welcoming having more players, especially players that can then down the line do acquisition, work, be helpful to the companies. So I think the number one thing is like, don't be afraid to expose. Vulnerability can be like a big thing of it. So I think it's first come over that. And some networks are more open than the others, but definitely whether it's the VC Unlocked network or the 500 VC that we build, which is just the investor community, it's really welcoming anyone. And most importantly, is build a platform for discussion.
And I can say that everyone I know at 500 are super nice, super welcoming. So definitively anyone listening should not hesitate to reach out to 500. Bedy, thank you. It was great talking to you today.
Likewise, it's a pleasure. Take care, everyone.